This place changed everything. Massive animals, water shooting up from the earth, rock formations that seemed painted. It was something not wholly to be paralleled elsewhere on the globe. Welcome to Yellowstone National Park. The beauty of Yellowstone is preserved by the federal government. But why was it protected? Who decided to even preserve the land in the first place? And why is it being questioned today? To answer those questions, we need to look at the history of Yellowstone, the first ever national park. Hi, my name is Tyler Conforti, and my school gave me $1,200 to help me create this documentary about national park preservation. Now more than ever, our parks are under threat by the government, and not enough people are talking about it. And so I road tripped across the country for 2.5 weeks to tell this story. This is episode 1 of the series. Welcome to Common Ground. The land of Yellowstone National Park once belonged to Indigenous people, and the most prominent tribe in this area was the Shoshone. Beyond that, a band of the Shoshone called the Tukadika lived directly in the mountains of Yellowstone. The name Tukadika means sheep eaters, and they got that name by doing just that. Their diet mainly comprised of the bighorn sheep in Yellowstone, and also berries, roots, and other things like that. The Native Americans here hunted and gathered very sustainably, and with lots of respect for the land and the animals. This is Obsidian Cliff, igneous rock formed over 100,000 years ago. Multiple Native American tribes have used this cliff to mine it and make tools and weapons out of it. They did this for thousands of years, even up until the advent of firearms. Now, Obsidian Cliff sits as a preserved historic site in Yellowstone National Park for tourists to come to and see this very important site of Native American history. There are also many places in Yellowstone National Park that hold great religious and spiritual significance to the Native Americans. The geysers and geothermal vents in Yellowstone were very spiritually important for the Shoshone. They used them for medical purposes as well as just a general tool for survival. However, the Shoshone were the only group of people who found these geysers amazing. The first Europeans who saw the land of Yellowstone National Park were just fur traders. But later, when Lewis and Clark went on their expedition, they passed by Yellowstone. However, they didn't really spend much time there, except for John Coulter, the first mountain man. Coulter spent lots of time out here. He explored it, mapped it, and lived out here. Then he told the stories to people in the east, and more people came. Some years after Coulter's explorations, other notable people came to Yellowstone looking for lucrative furs and exotic sights. One of those people was Daniel Potts, who wrote stories about his adventures in a Philadelphia newspaper. Then, as the first recorded non-Native American to ever see the geysers, Jim Bridger literally told campfire stories and spread epic tales about his time in Yellowstone. Later on in the 1830s, Osborne Russell published his account of what the region had to offer. All of these explorers who told stories about Yellowstone inspired more and more people to go out and venture into the western frontier. Many more explorers came out west to see what all the fuss was about, and one of those explorers was the photographer William Henry Jackson. William Henry Jackson took photos here in 1871, but not just here at the Yellowstone Canyon, but everywhere throughout the park and surrounding area. At the geysers, this canyon, the mountains, the plains, everywhere. That 1871 photo shoot convinced Congress to create the very first national park here in Yellowstone. And that was only the next year in 1872. President Ulysses S. Grant created the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act. Yellowstone National Park will serve as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, and it will be placed under exclusive control of the Secretary of Interior. It will be reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale. Now, make sure you remember that part where it says withdrawn from sale, because it'll be pretty important down the road. Anyways, as the legislation says, the parks have always fallen under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior. At first, Yellowstone was run by appointed superintendents to oversee the maintenance and protection of the parks. However, they were too ineffective at making sure visitors weren't being destructive. A prominent example of this was uncontrolled poachers. And animal populations are still recovering from the devastation of uncontrolled poachers, and so if we aren't intentional about protecting them, we may lose them completely. The solution to this was to bring in the army, to enforce the laws and protect the parks. When the army first got here, it was Superintendent Norris and other troopers who were stationed right here in this cabin. However, the only problem with that is that the army wasn't able to sustain the educational demands of the visitors who were going to the parks. And so, in comes the National Park Service. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson signed the Organic Act, which created the National Park Service and gave other protections to national parks. The National Park Service is a system that includes areas of historical as well as scenic and scientific importance. And their purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Wow, they wrote a little differently 110 years ago, and if you followed every word of that, I'm honestly impressed. But anyways, ever since its creation, the National Park Service has always prioritized multiple important facets of the national parks, without sacrificing one for another. Remember that for down the road. And that's actually reinforced by their mission statement. The National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. That word choice about preserving these parks for future generations shows up across all of the history of the parks and also on both sides of the political spectrum. And we'll talk more about that later on. The National Park Service went through a lot of leadership changes, but the first director of the National Park Service was Stephen Mather. But the first director of the national parks was Stephen Mather. He ironically began his career working at a mining company. But then, after a trip to Europe, he was inspired to take up nature conservation. Long story short, he publicized the parks and garnered lots of public support for them, until eventually in 1917, he was appointed as the first director of the National Park Service. At that time, a man named Horace Albright was the superintendent at Yellowstone and Mather's legal assistant during the early years of the NPS. Albright was a lawyer before he worked at the Department of the Interior, and then he went on to lead the NPS. That's part of the reason why he was actually qualified for the role, unlike some people in Washington these days. But that's a discussion for later. Anyways, Albright was the superintendent for Yellowstone until 1929, where he then succeeded Mather as the director of the NPS all the way until 1933. Mather and Albright did so well when establishing Yellowstone that it was used as a precedent when creating the rest of the national parks. For example, John Muir pushed to make Yosemite into a national park, modeling it after Yellowstone. But while we're talking about significant people for the national parks, we've got to talk about Theodore Roosevelt. He visited Yellowstone in 1903, and it was actually the most extensive presidential visit to date. He had so much fun there, gallivanting throughout the land and enjoying the wildlife that he said the geysers, the extraordinary hot springs, the lakes, the mountains, the canyons, and the cataracts unite to make this region something not wholly to be paralleled elsewhere on the globe, and it must be kept for the benefit and enjoyment of all of us. Later that same year in 1903, President Roosevelt created the Roosevelt Arch at the north entrance of the park, inscribed at the top of the words, "For the benefit and enjoyment of the people," quoted directly from the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act of 1972. And at a time when there's such division, that sentiment is some really solid common ground. And I'd like to reiterate that the idea that these natural wonders should be protected for future generations is held by people on both sides of the political spectrum and across history. In 1872, Yellowstone was created for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. And after years of rich history, that goal is still being achieved today. However, the current administration has taken deliberate actions to shrink and weaken the National Park Service. But I'll save the rest of the discussion for later in this documentary. But hey, you know what they say. The windshield is larger than the rearview mirror for a reason. Well, that wraps up this episode about the history of Yellowstone, but make sure to stay tuned for the next episode about the environmental impact of Grand Tetons National Park. See you then.